Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you're with Mike
and Ian
as we reread the Aubrey Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brien. This week, though, a pause in that rereading. Ian, what do we got in store today?
Well, Mike, we are indulging ourselves in a bit of self-congratulation. Just a couple of episodes ago, we turned the 200. We turned bicentennial is what we turned. So we're taking a moment to just celebrate the fact that we got to this great milestone with the support of all of our listeners and supporters and guests. We have been asking you on social media for your questions that you'd like Mike and me to answer. We've got them listed here. Just about everybody's question, one way or another, gets an answer. We are going to do our best to answer them in as interesting and truthful a way as we can. We are going to give ourselves the freedom to cover spoilers, so bear that in mind if you haven't listened all the way to the end of the canon yet. We hope that you won't mind that we're going to call out your names. If you send us a question, we'll try and credit you for asking the question. If you're a Patreon supporter, then keep your ears pinned back, because 4 of you kindly also sent us audio clips of you asking the questions. So we want to say, of course, as we always do, an extra big thank you to our Patreon supporters who make the show possible. And we hope you're going to enjoy hearing yourselves and hearing what inanities Mike and I can bring to answer the questions. To provide a little bit of light relief from me and Mike as well, we've got a little guest appearance by longtime friend of the show, Steve Morris, talking about one of his particular interests that answers one of your particular questions. So look out for that. Mike, let's get started. We have a multiple offender, actually, a serial offender, listener Anthony Vogel, who's also a Patreon supporter, who we'll hear from later. But he got straight onto this on Twitter. We're on the subject of our favorites, Mike, from you and me. Anthony asks, who is your favorite character other than Jack and Stephen, and why? And also, way back in the beginning, we mentioned that some people might call themselves as being Team Jack or Team Stephen. Do you have an opinion? And has it changed? So, Mike, how about you? Favorite characters, and which team are you rooting for?
Oh, thanks, Ian. Well, Anthony, it's a great question here. So, favorite character is Diana, because she's like, as so many people have said, Rachel McMillan on our show, one of the most complex, one of the best female characters in all literature. She's amazing. And that's why for her, but I would also say Sophie, because in many ways, and I wish we had more time with her, I think she is, but also in similar ways and different ways. And then the surprise, because I never really thought about a ship being a character, and I love the surprise. So there. Then there's the whole, Pullings and Babington and Padine, people that we grow up with, people that have their own unique view in the world, people that are, and that list could be endless going through the canon here. So, right. Ian, those are my characters. How about yours?
I think I like your list. I'd add to the list, I have a fondness for Sir Joseph Blaine. We might talk about him later.
Yes.
I have a fondness for the Odabashi from Treason's Harbor for reasons that I can't explain, except that hearing his dialogue makes me smile every time. And I think also Lord Clonfert. He's a really fascinating character. Not what you'd call a favorite, not somebody I'd like to spend time at dinner with, but a really fascinating, really well-drawn character who played a really important role in just one book, but super memorable. So, Mike, I'm going to say I hop between Team Jack and Team Stephen.
Nice.
So sometimes I think I am Team Sophie, especially towards the end of the canon.
Yeah.
How about you? Team Jack or Team Stephen?
Well, it's interesting, and I think I think, Anthony, you said so, like, did you have an opinion? Has it changed? I think for me it did. It was, I think I started out thinking these books were about Jack Aubrey, and so I was Team Jack. But then very, very quickly in the first book, I was thinking, wait, it's called Aubrey Maturin. I think I understand why. And then as I continued on, I was going, why is it called Aubrey Matron? Why isn't it called Matron Aubrey? So
Yeah.
I've been bouncing all around here. But in the end, I absolutely am coming down on the fact that, when like in these books in my life, I can't imagine it without those particular friends. So I'm a solid member of Team Friendship.
Oh, yeah, that's great. And that's how we got started, right? This is a
Yeah,
project for you and me. Oh, it's fantastic.
absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, thank you again for the question, Anthony.
Well, Rob Finch had a fascinating. What character would you like flogged around the fleet? And why is Killick the best support character in all literature? There's a fascinating combination. Love that.
Well, I'm going to take a swerve on the Killick question, not because I don't have an answer, but I think Mike's got an excellent answer. And we're going to talk about Killick a couple of times today. It's funny, even the baddies, I don't all necessarily want to see flogged around the fleet. Because so many of the people who are sort of antagonists to our heroes have redeeming features. There are a couple who don't, of course. The one who I think really deserves a flogging around the fleet is Captain Corbett, the commander in Mauritius Command who flogged
Oh,
Barrett Bonden.
oh.
May he be forgiven. Oh my gosh. So,
I,
Mike, help us out here. Let's deal with the Killick question. And why is indeed preserved Killick the best support character in all literature? That's quite the
oh,
claim.
I will jump right on that. I'm sitting here now going, why did I not think of Corbett? Of course. Well, I love Killick. And I think because he's such a great example of what O'Brien tells us so well. Everyone is human, and Killick is especially so. He is who he is. He's a great support character. And O'Brien uses him very sparingly, yet we get such an incredible picture of him as a person on his own interaction with Jack and Stephen and others, and over time. Now, it's probably a little bit of a conceptual stretch, but I love the way O'Brien works with Killick, the same way I love the way Stephen King completely immerses us in the perfect, ordinary details of everyday life so convincingly before unbelievable things happen very believably. And
Right.
so I think it's just, Killick's just a great example. Who else taken a couple of random sketches of killing scenes would say, oh, one of the best support characters in literature. Oh, we know.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, flogged around the fleet. Andrew Ray came to mind, the Duke of Haberstall, Mrs. Williams. Forgive me, Mrs. Williams. I know not a very Christian thought, and I have to love all the adjective stacks that she inspires in the canon. And General Aubrey came to mind, but
Ooh.
I have to come back to you, Corbett. Yeah, probably the man who would do that to Barrett Bondon. Shame, fie.
Well, Mike, we're going to stay in the world of character. And this time we're going to listen to some audio. Our good friend and medieval Latin expert, Karen Ruff, who's also a Patreon supporter, so double thank you, Karen, sent us this question about our view of some of the characters.
Greetings, Ian and Mike. Give you joy of your ducentesimal, gentlemen. This is Karen, your consulting Latinist, with a question for the celebratory episode. Is there a character, major or minor, about whom your views have changed with the most recent circumnavigation at podcast speed, or with repeated circumnavigations? Perhaps someone with whom you have more or less patience now, or about whom you've realized something that escaped you before, or whom you see differently as you sail back around to their early days in the canon, or whose development in O'Brien's writing is newly intriguing.
I was so intrigued by Karen's questioning, and that I couldn't help when we were chatting about some Latin in one of our latest episodes. I had to say, well, how about you, Karen? What do you think? And she said, well, I was thinking in part how we discovered that Killick is not really Killick yet in Patrick Tull's rendition of him in the very early books. And in fact, that she said he isn't really kind of a fully formed character until we get a couple of books in. So it's understandable that Tull doesn't quite get him yet. And so I thought, yeah, boy, we're tracking, because I'd been thinking a lot about killing since that original question came in. But Karen also says, I find that my patience with Diana's behavior wears very thin now that I'm a middle aged woman. And she's very kind to say, but I'm sure there are other more interesting answers for those who have been circumnavigating with more attention. I feel a bit like I've been sailing around and around and around and have lost track of time. Well, here. I agree with that. Ian, how about you?
Characters that I changed my opinion of, lots of them in small ways. I mean, including in some ways Jack and Stephen. Maybe I'll go back to Clonfert again. I remember reading Mauritius Command, which I liked, but it's not my favorite of the canon, never has been. And I wrote off Clonfert as a rather irritating kind of poseur and a dilettante. But actually, I didn't start to like him, but I started to appreciate all the depths and the kind of fascination of his character. Also, I think that Sir Joseph Blaine, early on in my readings, he's just the sort of spy master, a bit like Q in James Bond. But the more you read of the little interventions he has with Stephen, though he acts as kind of a chorus for some of Stephen's life, his professional life, and to a certain extent his personal life as well. I love that Sir Joseph Blaine is always there for Stephen, and he has his own set of foibles and vulnerabilities, and he's a very low-key but wonderfully written secondary character. That's mine anyway. Who else should we be thinking about here, Mike?
Well, it's funny. I kept thinking changed. I'm not sure. I mean, and there's so many people. It's Sam Panda being one that I think, gosh, I wish we could have seen more of him. I wanted I wanted to grow up with him a little bit more. I wanted to change with him a little bit more. I wanted to see him and Jack together some more. In terms of development with this slow read, I've really enjoyed, like you said, Ian, Jack's development and Stephen's development. I think I plowed through the canon so fast the first time, and I'll come to that later maybe, that I didn't really appreciate that as much. And my greatest change, however, is just my appreciation and the depth of that appreciation for the way O'Brien shows us rather than tells us.
Yeah.
Especially about characters and kind of their development. The way he sets the scene, delivers deep insight based on descriptions like of weather, of external descriptions, of short comments by once and done secondary characters, by what otherwise might be viewed as completely different scenes. I mean, you could kind of take it as just a description, and then you realize, oh, whoa, you see what he was doing there?
Going on here,
for anybody who's kind of wondering, what is he talking about? Think back to the praying mantis scene in Master and Commander, and think back to what came before, what came right after, all of that. And we'll have one coming up soon in I think in our next read.
Yeah, I think we will. Exactly right. So, like I said, we've got a couple of repeat offenders. So, repeat offender is the wrong word. Repeated honoured guests. Rob, who couldn't resist adding to his tally of questions here. Rob Finch on Twitter. Thank you, Rob. This is a question that's going to make the most sense if you're British, and I'll explain why in a second. Rob asks, what is your desert, or in parentheses, desolation, island book of the canon? And we have a related question from Mike Taylor, who asks, what's your favorite? The desert island thing is interesting. Like any Radio 4 listener, I'm a fan of a show called Desert Island Discs, where you get to choose music that you take with you. But we'll come back to Desert Island Discs in a second. I'm going to say, for me, it depends on what the desert island circumstances are and what I'm otherwise most in need of. If it's the kind of situation where I need a guilty pleasure, it's probably going to be the one that makes me smile the most, which narrowly goes to Treason's Harbor. Again, the Odabashi, Zutalor, Harabedian, sharks, gold, the whole thing. I think it's great.
Nice.
If I need an absorbing workout, if I want to really relish reading deeply into a book, I think it's got to be Post Captain. But there are certainly going to be other books in the canon. Now, if I really was cast away on a desert island, like happens in the BBC Radio 4 show, Desert Island Discs, I've got to remember as well that I also have the Bible and Shakespeare with me, which kind of helps, maybe leans me a little bit more towards Treason's Harbor. And I'd get to have 8 different pieces of music. And good news, at least one of those would be the Bach cello suites. Probably no Boccherini, I'm afraid, but certainly the Bach cello suites, unless it so happens that the luxury they let me take happens to be my cello, in which case I won't be listening to any music. I'll be spending all my time trying to learn the E-flat major prelude, which is a swine. So, Mike, how about you? Favorites? What's the one that you're going to pack in your travel bag for your time on a desert island?
Yeah, well, in for me, but let me pause for a second. Ian just mentioned all that about the cello, and it occurs to me that unless you were listening a long time ago when we changed theme music, and unless you kind of paid particular attention to that show, you might not know that the guy playing the cello on our theme music is Ian Bradley. So
It is,
I
that's
just
right.
I just love it. I just relish every, in the intros and the outros. I'm just like, that's Ian playing. So
Oh,
thank you,
thank
Ian.
you.
I'm glad you'll have your cello with you on the island.
I
For
hope
me,
so.
on the island, it's going to be HMS Surprise. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just and I'll talk about it later with favorite vignettes, but just this incredible breadth of mastery that O'Brien demonstrates. And so when you do that, you think, gosh, particularly comparing and contrasting, which we're about to do, Post Captain with HMS Surprise, very different, very masterful as he's really getting here. And but like you, Ian, you made me think a little bit. Well, Shipwrecked. Maybe I need a longer book. Maybe I do need Post Captain. So
Yeah.
who knows?
Fascinating stuff. We're
Ah.
still not done with favorites, though, right?
No, Matt Campbell asked us, was there a particular book that was all round more enjoyable to cover? What do you think, Ian?
It's a really interesting variation on the question. I had a really good time dissecting Post Captain, which we've effectively done
Yeah.
twice now, and I got a huge amount out of that. The ones that I enjoyed savoring and talking about with you and digging behind the references for, it's really hard. Up on the list are going to be HMS Surprise, Treason's Harbor, and Surgeon's Mate for the part that plays in the arc of Diana and Stephen.
Right.
But it's really difficult.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. It is really difficult because, Matt, you're asking about more enjoyable. And I'm thinking I'm not really equipped to answer that right now because what I found is as we've been doing this, and thanks to your comments, everybody, the listeners out there, slowing it down, going a little deeper,
Yeah.
I've just loved each next book even more because of getting to linger over it, getting to have these discussions, getting to hear what you were thinking and saying. So the more the more time we spend, the more we dug in, the more we reread, the better each book becomes. So I'm thinking, well, I'm going to have to really do this a time or two more at this pace to be able to say which one.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Mike. We have a question from Twitter user Bob B. Bob.B. If that's you, then congrats and thanks for asking us your questions on Twitter. We have another favorite question, which is not so much about a book or a character as a moment. Bob asks, if you could pick one vignette or moment from the entire series that you think encapsulates what makes these books phenomenal, which would you pick and why? Mike, I've got an idea of where you might be headed with this one. I think this is, I think I'm pretty close to where you are. Tell us about it.
Yeah. You remember me being in tears, probably trying to discuss this and read
Yeah.
through this, back when we did our first HMS Surprise. The I am of her cast
Yeah.
just nailed me. So when I said, talk about it more, and it was not only Stephen and that scene right there, it was contrasted with the fact that just a little earlier in that chapter, Diane had said, I should have to know much more about her, talking about Dill, before I could say anything of the least real use. Her cast and so on. So this idea that, oh, her cast, very important. Really can't say anything. Steven, it's like, no, we're anyway. I won't go into it again. But and as soon I think as that came to mind, I thought, what? I'm of her cast, and how do you separate that from Off Hats and the pillory scene?
Off
And
Hats.
so, okay, so sorry, Bob B. It's not just one vignette, but those are two moments for me that are unbelievable.
Oh, the sailors surrounding him and cheering in Exchange Square.
Oh, love it.
Mike, I think that those would both be really, really at the top of my list too. I'll add a couple of sort of bubbling under candidates for vignettes of the whole series. I remember being really struck, having started with Master and Commander, I remember being really struck by the conversation, the below decks conversation between Stephen Maturin and James Dillon. And I thought this sets the tone. It also set the pattern for how lots of the characterization comes out in conversations like this. And if O'Brien guides our heart with these great moments of kind of declaration and discovery, he guides our heads with the way the characters wrestle with ideas that they are finding contradictory and that they want to kind of hold up and examine. So the James Dillon piece was fabulous. And also two other really great discovery moments for me. One was the end of Desolation Island, where Louisa Wogan and Herapath are, in air quotes, permitted to escape. And we get this very strong hint that Bondon was in it all along, and it's the payoff of this great, big, long, complicated kind of intelligence gavotte that's been played out. I love that, again, for the intellectual side. I'm also going to say Stephen's very confessional conversation with Clarissa Oakes in The Far Side of the World. Or
Right.
Far Side of the World. Sorry, no, in Clarissa Oakes. What am I talking about?
Clarissa Oakes. Right. Yeah, there we go.
so some great moments. And of course, once you start to list them, you realize there are loads and loads more. But those are great choices.
Well, Ian, going back to Twitter, Gisco Disco. There we go.
Great screen name. Thank you, Gisco.
Love that name. What was your most exciting battle in the entire series, which left you on the edge of your seat for the entire duration? And I'm trying to think back to how many times did I talk about having white knuckle moments as reading and discussing and stuff. So I suspect that it's, for me, it's going to be with the ship that I'll never be able to pronounce. How do I do this here? But the desolation, in the lower 40s, it just amazing encounter.
It's fantastic. I'll add to the list two more. I really enjoyed the encounter with Admiral Lenoir's squadron at the end, last few chapters of HMS Surprise. I don't know why. I don't know what it is about it. Nice. But I really enjoyed it. Plus, maybe this is me being biased towards things that we've done recently. The cutting out of the Fanciulla and Jack swimming with the rope to get the Polycrest off the sandbank was really, really special for me too. Not only because it was really excitingly told action, but because we'd earned it. It wasn't just heroics to fill pages. It was really, really well earned and played a part in the whole character story. But Mike, I think your choice is right up there, though. I think the Vaxamheit, sinking in Desolation Island, breathtaking, really breathtaking.
Well, and I'm going to go back the other way and say, yeah, that whole cutting out story and Jack and Stephen and where we were, that, ditto on that as well.
Excellent. And it's interesting. He's given us few enough real battle scenes that you can actually choose between them. And it's a mark of the quality, I think, that he didn't choose to go straight to action and blood and thunder to keep the pages turning. And you have to wait quite a long time. But goodness me, when you get to them, they're really, really worth the wait.
Too true.
So we've heard a little bit already from our good friend Mike Taylor. Mike also reached out on our Facebook Messenger channel to ask another kind of favorite. Now, we've talked about the serious and maybe even dark stuff and the emotional highlights and lowlights. Here's a nice question from Mike. What is your favorite Aubreyism or example of Patrick O'Brien's ability to inject humor into his writing? Great question from Mike. to the other Mike. What have you got?
Well, it's funny, Mike. Back to Mike here. I think the greatest example of O'Brien's ability to inject humor into his writing is all the places that when I had Patrick Tall in my ear, I have inappropriately cracked up in libraries, in plane rides, in all over, and people like, what's going on with you? But rather than, and I'll get to an Aubreyism, I'll do one because there's so many and they're so great, but I I really, really, really enjoy Jack laughing at the littlest things. Jack's laughing at himself. Jack doing all that. And, as Ian, you pointed out, Dylan said, he derives a greater pleasure from a smaller stream of wit than any man I have ever known. And God bless you, Jack. I love that. I'm with you, brother. So I think for an Aubreyism, I'll go to the far side of the world because it's a triple Aubreyism with an assist from Stephen Matrin.
Ooh.
So Jack saying, in a near-run thing, it is the captain's duty to be on deck, urging his ship through the water by the combined effort of his will and his belly muscles. You may say it is buying a dog and barking at the stable door yourself. All right, we've got one already. The stable door after it is locked, said Stephen, holding up his hand. Just so, says Jack, the stable door after it is locked yourself. But there are more things than heaven and earth, you know. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh. Of course, to keep a dog and bark yourself, to lock the stable door after the horse is bolted. Of course, had me at horse.
Yeah.
And there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than dreamt in your philosophy from Shakespeare. How do you do this, Patrick O'Brien? Just keep them coming.
They are great. That's a really, really great first choice. I really love, for comedy that is led by Jack Aubrey, but is probably not strictly an Aubreyism, the moment in Fortune of War when he describes himself to the American kind of government interrogator as John Aubrey, grandson to the Pope of Rome, and he goes on about Stephen Maturin in Drunk as a Lord by 10 and never a shoe to his name. Has me in kinks every time. I'm also a fan of the Aubreyism where he describes himself as having been out of sorts. He says, I am afraid I have been like a bear in a horse bed these last few days.
Right. And who hasn't said that?
Which of us has not at least framed the thought, if not actually uttered it? Fun times.
Well, just like we keep coming back to these wonderful things, I think we got to come back to Mike Taylor again, on Messenger. If you had to pick one other author that might come close to O'Brien in terms of literary quality, depth of research, readability, etc., who is that author? And name your favorite book by them.
It's difficult because I wouldn't want to put any other literary author alongside O'Brien because I think it's not fair. Jane Austen, you would say. Graham Greene, you might say. Any one of a dozen 20th century authors. We've talked about Ursula Le Guin before. I'm going to say that the one that I sort of place alongside O'Brien as one that I really admire and is readable because they have a hint of the sort of genre about them, but also have really, really deep roots and also dry humor, is John le Carré. And if you want my John le Carré recommendation, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is the classic. The Night Manager is also fabulous. So that would be me. How about you, Mike?
Well, I have to say, Mike, honestly, I'm still looking. If you find her or him, please let me know.
Yeah.
I'm like you, Ian. All of this in one package. Sorry. Yeah. Don't know.
Really, really hard to hold one up. It's a tough challenge, but those are the things that we have to face head on, Mike. That's the grave responsibility of being an amateur podcast host. Is
Yes.
Very good. We get to turn now to a question from one of our excellent Patreon supporters, Mark Pruitt. Takes us in the direction of the movie, which is one of the most, I'm going to say, over-discussed topics in the internet world of O'Brien fandom. But there are some wrinkles that are important for us to sort of get into right now. First important wrinkle is the news that we've had in the last year or so that it is supposed that the author Patrick Ness has been engaged to write a script for another Patrick O'Brien movie. Mark asks, IMDb no longer shows that Patrick Ness is still working on a Master and Commander script. Can we get some insider info on where it's at? Hey, Mark, if we were insiders, we'd give you the info, but we're not.
Right.
So I'm afraid I've got crickets for you. There's a reason why they call it development hell. It's because it's hell and sometimes development doesn't happen. So who knows? It may mean that the whole thing is off the boil. It may mean that a script is about to burst forth with the director signed on and the cast all ready to start principal photography next week. You just don't know. I will say, and we mentioned this in our last episode as well, David Grann's book, The Wager, is rumored / expected to be the subject of a movie. There's that to keep us occupied and intrigued.
Fingers crossed if that does well, maybe we got a little daylight appearing for people to say, oh, there's an appetite for this. Let's get some more.
Yeah, indeed.
Rob Finch on Twitter says, now that Peter Weir has retired, who should direct the canon Netflix series? And who should be cast in the Stephen and Jack roles now?
Well, direct means something different in TV land than it does in movie land. So the director is not necessarily the kind of prime creative mainspring of the whole thing. TV series tend to have showrunners who are credited as either creators or sometimes producers. And the director job is parceled out per episode. I think that's generally how it goes in TV. So if not a director, then which showrunner? I'm not enough of a TV insider to have a strong opinion about this, but I know that Rachel Condon and Justin Marks did a pretty awesome job with the miniseries Shogun, which is just wrapped. So how about them, Condon and Marks? Why not? I have nothing to add to the internet speculation about who should you cast as Stephen and Jack, except that Anthony Hopkins is now too old to play Stephen Maturin.
Right. Well, I think I'm with you, Ian. I think I've done that for so long, and I thought I finally give up. Please let me see daylight. And then I'll take anybody. Give us anybody. I just want to see this thing done. Oh,
very good. Well, let's go back to our Patreon repeat customers again. Very, very happy to have another question from Anthony Vogel. Anthony's got an interesting, specific little detail to pick up on here. Anthony, who's on our Patreon page, says, I don't remember many specific dates being shared throughout the canon. So, is there a reason for May 23rd to be the date that Jack becomes a post captain? It feels like it might be a specific allusion of some kind. Mike, I've got nothing on this. What do you think?
No, May 23rd. I'm with you, Ian. I have no idea. I suspect it's not, paying homage to Stephen's interest in Linnaeus, our taxonomist that we hear about 11 times in the canon in 9 different books, who was born on May 23rd, but in 1707.
Ooh, good
so
research.
I'm not sure that's it. I don't think that's it. It's a great question. Now, it just occurs to me as we're saying this, I know there was there was a historical precedent for Cochrane, I believe, not getting, having, no influence, having some influence. And I didn't look back to see if May 23rd figured into that. Not sure. There's a couple of our listeners who are, have forgotten more about Cochrane than I ever knew. So by all means, let us know if we missed something about May 23rd and Cochrane. Well, John Scott on Facebook said, if the books had carried on, do you think that Stephen and Jack would have been able to still sail together? It looks like many of the admirals are pretty shorebound. The war is over. Stephen may well have a new wife. I don't know enough about world history to know what other adventures they would have been able to engage with.
Oh, thank you. Great question. Well, you're right. There wasn't very much naval warfare of the fleet action variety in the middle and later decades of the 19th century. Maybe the Crimean War, 1850 onwards. Jack Aubrey would have been pretty old by then. Maybe the Chinese Opium Wars might have been an outlet for some of Stephen's kind of Oriental spy mastery hijinks. But this was pretty much a time of what you might call Pax Britannica, and lots of senior officers, including the real world Lord Cochrane, had fairly peaceful careers, sometimes shore-based, sometimes flying around the globe because we had grabbed for ourselves this big old empire, showing the flag in different corners of the empire. I don't think they would have encountered an enemy to match Napoleon. Maybe, therefore, some opportunities for Stephen to botanize even more than he already had. What do you think, Mike?
Well, whatever little about world history there, John, I will tell you that I know less. So my answer is based purely on my fictional speculation, which is, of course, they would have sailed together. What are you talking about? Stephen and Jack not sailing together. If they couldn't get a professional gig, a naval gig, they would have, somebody would have bought the surprise back or something like that. And can you not imagine Stephen and his new love interest / bride, these botanizers, and Jack, I'm sure, finding something to do to make a little money. And professionally, like you said, Ian, even though there weren't a lot of opportunities, Cochrane himself served 3 years after becoming a vice admiral, and probably would have served even longer, even though he was 79. But some of his old extreme ideas, some of the political antagonism that had built up, his ideas about kind of the extreme methods of warfare being employed, scared some officials off from making him commander of the Baltic Fleet in 1853 in the Crimea action. So, you're right, Ian. There were a few things there, and there were some admirals who, well into long age, still were afloat and doing some interesting things. So, I don't know. Great question, John.
Really,
but of course they would. Regardless. I don't. Don't saddle me with reality. I'm having too much fun with Jack and Stephen.
That's one for everybody to carry their own headcanon. I think that's the word that people used to talk about these days. Carry your own headcanon around.
Right.
Stuff. Now, we have a question now on audio from another of our fabulous Patreon supporters, Julia. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for getting in touch. Thank you for being willing to ask us a question. Here it comes.
Hi, Ian and Mike. Thank you very much for your wonderful podcast. It really enhances my reading of the Patrick O'Brian books. I wondered how many times you've both circumnavigated the novels. And do you start at the first and read through or pick up a favourite? I realise that working on the podcast might have changed this. For context, I came to the books last February after hearing Dominic Sandbrook talk about them on the Rest is History podcast. And I think I'm already on my way to a second circumnavigation. Now you're doing the fabulous extended episodes on the first few books.
The answer from me, Julia, is I have no idea, but I'm sure it's more than 5. I'm pretty sure in I Ching, ancient Chinese maths, more than 6 is infinity. So I'm pretty close to having read the canon more than 6 times. My wife would say, "Oh my gosh, you're reading those books again," and that'll be that. Always starting at the beginning. I'm predictable and boring like that. So, Mike, I think your circumnavigation story has got a bit more to it.
Well, it does, and you're a part of every bit of it. So technically, I might be able to technically say I'm on my 4th, but the fact of the matter is, I read them in 2009 when Ian introduced them to me, and it was shortly after starting that I was diagnosed with kidney cancer, fairly advanced. And I really didn't have any idea if I'd actually get to finish the series. So I raced through them. Spoiler alert, I live. And, I was around when COVID started to start my second circumnavigation. So second one, I was always, why did you wait? Well, one thing is, after I got through the first time, I just kept asking Ian, well, what else is there? What else is there? What else is there? And I read all these other Age of Sail series, kept saying, love that, but it wasn't as good as. Like that, but it wasn't as good as. And I honestly had, I'll touch a belaying pin here, a little bit of a superstition. I thought, what happened last time you were reading this? Maybe we shouldn't read that again. But COVID hit, said, I'm gonna give it a go. Found out very quickly Ian had done the same thing. Ian said, let's go find a podcast to listen to while we're reading through together. And I thought, oh, that's cool. what's a podcast, Ian? He told me. I went, well, there's got to be one then if that's what it is and everybody's doing it. Well, I found one. It's in Portuguese. So we said, let's do it. So gladly, thankfully, Ian could manage all this and I would get to read through it again with him. I say technically, I'm on more than two, maybe because we've read them through a time at least already for doing this. We're coming back again. And I thought, well, how do I count the fact that every week, I read the same chapter 5 times or listen to it twice and read it 3 times and highlight it. And so I don't know. I don't know how any of that works. But I am like Ian, always front to back. Always front to back. Yeah, I don't select them down. Although maybe sometimes in the future I will.
Great question. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Julia, as well, for getting us there. I want to say thank you to Ken Douglas as well for the next question, which came in on Facebook Messenger. What has your observations about the nature of the friendship between Stephen and Jack taught you about your own friendship? Thank you, Ken, because it's a really particular thing to be making a podcast with my buddy Mike. You realize that, we are acting upon a friendship and also reading about a friendship. I have some spoilers for you. Mike, you and I have never fought a duel. I'm pretty sure we've never chased the same woman. I'm pretty sure we've never been shipwrecked together. I think none of the particularly grave things have happened to us. But the idea of, celebrating just being in company with your friend and taking what comes as you voyage around the world. I don't think it's changed my perspective on friendship, but it's increased the depth of my appreciation.
Yeah, I would echo Ian's thought. I mean, we have traveled the world together in our business pursuits. We've done amazing things, learning about, the history of places and meeting these fascinating people, and both professionally and personally. I've learned so much about it. But I think it also, in terms of how the O'Brien books have kind of reflected about our friendship, it's really reinforced for me how two very different people can be such good friends because of shared interest. And because for me, for sure, those particular friends make you a much better version of yourself. So, and I see the same thing in the book. So thank you, Ian. Thank you, O'Brien.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Ken. Twitter, Peter Nickel says, I would love to hear about how your appreciation for the true brilliance of O'Brien grew during this project. I really heard you both come into a respect for the material as great literature. Well spotted. Yeah.
It's very true. And I don't think I would have had any doubt at the beginning of our reading for the podcast that it was great literature. And I don't think I would have ever said it was anything less than brilliant, because that was what made it worthwhile. But it's certainly true that the material showed itself to be so worth the treatment and so worth the slowing down and digging in. Or not only the skill in adding layers and illusions, although you could write that off as the sort of ravings of a crossword puzzle addict, and I don't think that would be true of O'Brien, and not fair either. So rather than just looking for the literature and the science and the philosophy and all the rest of it, I would also say look at the character, the way the characters are drawn and the way the arcs are built, immediately chapter by chapter and over the very long term, book by book, is absolutely breathtaking. And I've certainly come to respect the growth of these characters even more as we dug into it.
Yeah, it's so interesting in that, and I just love this question and thinking about it. I mean, I remember back to the start of, I really liked the books. I was puzzled by a lot, and you got me through it. You said, Mike, you don't have to understand, ship rigging any better, any more than you have to understand photon torpedoes or warp speed or anything else. Just go with it. And it took me through it. I loved the insights and observations about people and being human, being more shades of gray than black and white. But this slower read through, I think, has just been like peeling the onion for me, because I was going so fast at first. And, I kept kind of, I think that was my big question when I was reading the other series, going, I like those, but I liked O'Brien better. What was it about O'Brien? And I've got some memory issues, so my wife would remind me from time to time what I liked about it and what I talked about. But the this idea of going through it, of interviewing people, of researching, of having such wide-ranging discussions with Ian as well as our guests and friends has really deepened my appreciation. And I'm gonna do like I always do on the show. I'm gonna reach out to somebody who knows better and steal a quote. And I think this was a great one. Ken Ringle, I think was Washington Post. He was one of the guys who introduced O'Brien to America again.
Yeah.
Has just written great things, spoke at O'Brien events and everything. At one of those O'Brien events at the Smithsonian I think in 2000, he said, this is part of his talk, don't great works of literature concern themselves ultimately with great themes? Well, yes, but what are they? When you come right down to it, there's only six: man versus God or fate, man versus nature, man versus woman, man versus man, man versus society, and man versus himself. That's really it, he says. All great literary themes boil down to those six. I encourage you as you read and enjoy the works of O'Brien to notice how skillfully and how profoundly he explores not just one of those themes, but every one in every book. And I thought, yeah, here we go.
That's it. It's a great quote. Bravo,
Right.
Ken.
Right.
Oh, very good. We've got a couple of fun distractions now. One of our long-time listeners, and who is often in touch with us on Facebook, and we really appreciate it, is Huub de Vaan. Huub is I think you're in the Netherlands. You've certainly got a Dutch name, and you've teased me and Mike about our pronunciation of Dutch, which is where I think this first question is going. Question for Ian, says Huub. How is your waakzaamheid? I've tried to pronounce it the best I can. How is your waakzaamheid? Do you need to be waakzaam dealing with Mike? Waakzaamheid being the name of the Dutch ship in the Desolation Island. Waakzaamheid meaning in Dutch watchfulness or wakefulness. Do I need to be watchful dealing with Mike? There are many more things in my life that I need to pay closer attention to than Mike, because Mike is super dependable.
Well, and often not worth paying attention to. So,
hardly.
Oh
I think I need to be waakzaam with myself rather than with Mike, to be quite honest.
Well, I was going to say that if he did need to be, and I was playing on the definition here, that it would probably be as a result of all my Harry Potter references. I'm always throwing them in. Luckily, we don't keep many of them in the show, just enough for being fun. But I was thinking about Alistair Mad Eye Moody, the ex-Auror, who says, constant vigilance. And I went to kind of backtrack that quote going, yeah, right, that, right. Am I right? But just like elementary, my dear Watson, that phrase as such never appeared in the books. It only was in the movie. And in the movie, it's actually not Alistair Moody who says it, but Barty Crouch Jr., who's pretending to be Moody with polyjuice potion. See, this is why you have to be watchful, because
good knowledge.
How about that?
Goodness me. Well, thank you for the question, Huub. I think he's got one for you as well, Mike.
Well, he does. He said, Mike, you often say, there you go. And he says, where do we go? Do you need us to go? And then he has a hashtag, not a native speaker. And it's funny. I do say that often. And I thought, well, I know what it means to me. Let me just look it up. And I found that there are a lot of definitions for there you go, none of which in the standard dictionaries are what I mean by it. Though I found in the slang dictionaries, it goes, oh, yeah, this is also what it means. So what I say it, I'm meaning to be encouraging. I'm meaning to say, like, good job, well done. There you go. There it is. So thank you. I think I've used this term for years, not realizing that, for some reason I picked it up. But I really appreciate you being, so alert, so watchful, so attentive in your vigilance and spotting that phrase about it. And I'm not going to say the word because I'll mispronounce it again.
Very good. Thank you again, Huub. Really, really fascinating questions. Now, we get to talk about lots of different topics that are sort of spin-offs from the core relationships and character arcs, and there have been so many that have brought us into contact with really fascinating people who can come and join us as interviewers and experts. There's a really interesting one that's got us thinking and researching extra just lately. Stephen Bienkowski on Facebook asked this: from what you know, was Patrick O'Brian really involved in intelligence during World War II, or is that just Patrick O'Brian spinning a yarn about himself?
You know what? I'm going to have to turn to you to get the facts, but my quick answer to this from my time getting White House clearances and, working with the CIA is we could tell you, but we could tell you, but,
This podcast will
won't
self-destruct in 30 seconds.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for the question, Stephen. It's really fascinating, as we keep on saying to ourselves. You're absolutely right. In one of his own essays that he wrote for the end papers of one of the novels, he said that he had served in World War II in some organization that had initials and did various devious things that he didn't want to talk about. This is the same essay in which he claimed to have been Irish and claimed to have been taught to sail on an actual boat. Now, neither of which turned out to be true. So we take all of this with a pinch of salt. There are mentions of this in the two biographical sources that we have. One is the book by Nikolai Tolstoy, his stepson, the part one of which I've got a copy of, and the other is Dean King's book, Patrick O'Brian, A Life Revealed. For both of these, there are some details that make it plausible, but not completely proven, that O'Brian did indeed work in intelligence in the Second World War. It seems that he worked for an organization in the British government that was called the Political Warfare Executive. It had a couple of other names as cover as it went along, but PWE, Political Warfare Executive, is the place where he seems to have worked. Now, there are no personnel records, at least none that anybody's been able to find. There are some plausible details in Tolstoy's book, including work that O'Brian is claimed to have done. It was not so much in intelligence in the field; it was more in the area of what you might call black propaganda.
Mm.
And there's an academic department at my old university, Durham University in England, that actually has a project team in the English department looking into the legacy of those 20th century English writers who served with PWE. And there's a whole bunch of them. Patrick O'Brian is not one of the names. I actually wrote an email to the leader of this academic team to say, hey, do you want to chat about Patrick O'Brian? And he hasn't chosen to respond. If you're interested, go look for Writers and Propaganda and look for them in the host name durham.ac.uk. And there's stuff to find out there about PWE and what they get up to. So, not proven. It seems likely and plausible that it's the kind of place where O'Brian might have ended up.
So, Ian, I'm always amazed that this audio version of which all we have is our audio version of The Lover's Hole has like 25 to 30% of its listeners on YouTube. Bless you all. We are delighted to have you.
We love you.
But yeah, we do love you. And if you could see us, you'd be glad it was audio. So Chana Sundown 4966 asks, at the end of our journey, in parens sob, after we read the unfinished novel together, and she says, I couldn't bear to read it alone, you and Ian both, well done. Says, I plan to read a biography of Patrick O'Brian. Number one, which do you recommend? Number two, I'd like to suggest that this book be added to the podcast schedule as the last book we read together. It would be so interesting to learn about O'Brian, and in particular to think about how his life and character interacted with his writing choices. You've done a bit of this throughout the series, plus dropped tidbits about his fascinating and enigmatic persona, which has whet my appetite to learn more. So, first off, thank you. I always love when somebody says, gosh, we'd really like more. And I'll start by answering by saying I have not read either of them, although I dip in and out of Dean King's from time to time in research for the show. And dare I say, we've actually had a conversation with Dean King. You know, trying to learn a little bit more. Really good guy, but I have not, the massive Tolstoy volume, which I've seen Ian carry in one of his checked suitcases. I haven't tried to tackle yet. So, Ian, you're better positioned than I am, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good question. I'll say that the content of both books might lead you to think, you should never meet your heroes.
Mm.
And if you want to just relish the towering genius of his writing work, you might be perfectly happy doing that and not reading the biographies. Because neither of them is complete for different reasons, and they are somewhat set against each other. The two books are, as we said, Dean King, Patrick O'Brian, A Life Revealed, published in the late 90s, and Nikolai Tolstoy's own book about Patrick O'Brian, which is appearing in 2 volumes. And they had different sources and certainly had a different intention. And I don't think you can compare the goodness or the correctness of them because they are incomparable with each other in terms of their starting point and what they were trying to do. There are important differences between the two that reflect nothing more than 2 people trying to write about a guy from 2 different perspectives. I will say, for what it's worth, that the Tolstoy book is trying to set right what it thinks Dean King misrepresented. I don't think that's a fair representation of Dean's work either. But Dean King had access to none of Patrick O'Brien's personal papers, whereas Nikolai Tolstoy had access to almost nothing but Patrick O'Brien's personal papers. Actually, that's not fair. He had access to a lot of other family papers that Dean King didn't have access to. If you're really interested, read both and draw your own conclusions, but understand the context in which the 2 books came about. I've got my opinion, and it might occur later on when we get into a couple of these subjects again. But they're fascinating. They won't leave you thinking, oh my gosh, this guy was wonderful. They'll leave you thinking, what a remarkable, you might say, representative of the 20th century kind of a life did O'Brian have, and must he have had, as you start to fill in the blanks, to have got to the point where he can produce literature like we all enjoy here.
So, Mike Taylor on Messenger. Mike says, if you were able to meet Patrick O'Brian himself and were given the opportunity to ask him 3 questions, what would you want to know?
Can I take a swing at that first?
Oh, please do, Ian. Yeah. Please do.
Well, for reasons that you probably heard in my voice in the answer to the previous question, I don't think I'd relish a conversation with O'Brian in person. I think I'd look forward to it. I think if I had the opportunity, I'd take it, but I don't think I'd enjoy it. But, and maybe this is more in tune with O'Brian himself as well, if I had a chance to write him a letter, which is something that he might have more appreciated anyway, I might ask him, I'd love to know where the humor comes from, because humor is all the way through his books.
Right.
And it's not guaranteed that you would be funny if you wrote books about the Napoleonic era navies based on the kind of source material that O'Brian wrote from. So I'd love to ask him in a letter, apart from Jane Austen, who, by the way, has great dry humor, apart from Jane Austen, Mr. O'Brian, which English language author or authors has made you laugh the most and contributes to the strand of humor that's clearly there in the books? And be interested to hear what the answer to that was. It's a completely fanciful idea because he is he's not been walking the face of the earth for 24 years now, so I'll never get to know. But that's what I think I'd ask.
Good. Well, if the seance session were available to us, I suspect he would be no different now than he was in life. I remember we were talking to a professional, associated with the U.S. kind of National Spy Museum, who had attended one of O'Brian's live events, and as in the U.S., and had his questions all picked out, and said that O'Brian started the evening saying, tonight all we're going to talk about is Jane Austen. So if you have any questions about Jane Austen, you can ask me now. And so I was thinking, I didn't think hard about this because I figured it probably wouldn't matter what I wanted to know. I'd hear from him whatever he wanted to talk about. But if I could, as you say, I'd love to know more about how he wrote and how that evolved over time. Not about his life, not about any about this, but just how do you do what you do? And not only with Aubrey Matron, but his other books as well. He's written some a diverse collection of books and over a long period of time. And be part of getting at which I think he wouldn't take at all well for me to say, how do you do what you do? Um, the last one I think I'd like to ask is, what else am I missing? When I've given all the things I found over time, studying, rereading, talking about it. I'm sure even with all that, I'm missing loads. Please give me some hints. Please give me a few pointers. Please show me something that I'm probably not seeing all that you've got there.
That would be a great question.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and hypotheticals often are when you've thought deeply about something. What if makes for a really fascinating strand of thought.
So Nick Jeffries on Twitter. Nick says that what's always been fascinating is the pitch perfect tone and style of the language O'Brien uses in his dialogue, which your podcast has demonstrated by the Ngram analysis of rarely used words. Do we know how he came upon this skill pre-internet? Yeah, always been a fascinating thing for me. How did he do this? Has he ever talked about his research? Ian.
Well, he was very proud of the amount of research that he'd done, perhaps to the extent of making him completely a hermit. At some point, he had cause to ask somebody in the mid-1990s, what is software?
Right.
Famously not very good at operating machines or gadgets of almost any kind around the house. So he talked about the amount of specifically naval research that he did, including letters and journals and logs. He was very well connected to people who also knew how to exploit the National Archives and all the various official research sources that exist, especially in the British world, about the Navy of the time. And he clearly also saw how people wrote. He could no doubt have quoted at length with great analytical insight from Jane Austen, from Samuel Johnson, and from the classics. I'm sure that he also read the Navy List and read contemporary newspapers and magazines. There's a great quote from an article by a guy called Tom Perkins. Tom Perkins was a wealthy businessman who got acquainted with Patrick O'Brien in the mid-1990s and ended up taking O'Brien on a cruise on Perkins' sailing yacht to the Balearics, which is a whole other story. But before this sailing trip, Perkins got to visit with Patrick and Mary O'Brien at their place in Collioure in the south of France. And Perkins says this: I was fascinated by his office, where the books were written. It was lined floor to ceiling with reference works on an array of subjects, botany, geography, zoology, medicine, etc., in several languages. But not a single volume was dated later than 1820. He was literally immersed in the period of his work. And by the way, if you're interested to find that the full text of that article, it was in an online magazine called Latitude 38, and the title of this article is called Cruising with Patrick O'Brien, The Man and the Myth, written back in the year 2000. So I think the answer is reading and reading and reading, and also conversely, not reading. He was practically excluding anything of the modern world from his purview, and the fact that he was absorbed in sources of pre-1820 mean that all of his vocabulary and usage, perhaps just by nature, perhaps just by instinct, ended up being of the period. And it's an incredible thing to have devoted your life and your attention and your brain to. So, Nick, fascinating question. Thank you. Next, we come to a question from another one of our patrons, and it's time for another audio contribution. Sina Hasuna. Sina, thank you for all your contributions online, and thank you for your support on the Patreon side of things. Let's hear what Sina has to ask us now about another spin-off topic.
Ahoy there, Mike and Ian. Congrats on 200 episodes. That's quite an achievement. My question for you is, if you could, which active tall ship sailing now would you sign on to sail the seas for maybe a season, 6 months, a year, or forever?
When I first saw this question, Sina, I thought, I know exactly. I'm going to phone a friend. I'm going to call Petra Karbach, who is HMS Speedy on Twitter. Yeah, she's a Facebook moderator of the Patrick O'Brien Appreciation Society, the Facebook group, and she has this phenomenal blog that are all things Cochrane. And like we just heard, her library is all these originals from way back. She's done a good bit of tall ship sailing as a result of the canon and falling in love with this era and all her research. And via Facebook Messenger, she said, "Since I'm a regular crew member of the brig Roald Amundsen, I would always choose her to sail in, but there are quite a few interesting tall ships out there. Gutenberg, Alexander von Humboldt, Sorlandit, Lady Washington, just to name a few, all of whose names I probably just slaughtered. I apologize in advance. To anyone new to sailing tall ships, she suggests booking a short trip aboard one of the many tall ships, just a few days to see what life at sea means, and then, before digging in deeper here."
Oh, fantastic! So watch out for Petra on the social channels. I've got to say, I'll confess right now, I love sailing. If you offered me the chance to go sailing for a weekend on a tall ship, I'd for sure take it. I don't have a hankering as a life goal to be afloat on a tall ship per se. I have a tedious addiction to modern facilities like electric windlasses and flush toilets, but it would be really, really fascinating. I do remember as well when we spoke to Captain Richard Bailey, who's the originator and for a while owner and master of the Rose, which became HMS Surprise in the movie. He gave us a couple of recommendations when he and Will Soffren interviewed with us. They said that if you're based in the US, you could do worse than check out the Foundation Tall Ships of America, which is tallshipsamerica.org. And there's also an international sail training kind of umbrella organization, sailtraininginternational.org. And there are many individual tall ships that offer sailing opportunities, like the ones that Petra shared with us. And wherever you are in the world, your local maritime museum or your local historical society might be a great place to start. And if anybody wants to invite me along for a weekend, by all means, reach out. Now, Mike, we get another interesting spin-off topic here, again from our friend Stephen Biankowski, who asks, what's the academic world's interest in Patrick O'Brien? He asks, do you know of any universities that have courses that teach the Patrick O'Brien canon? Is there a repository of essays, papers, or postgrad work on the canon? And Mike, what have we found out when we dug into this?
Well, it is really interesting. You would think there would be more. So, college courses, I found at least one that did exist. I think you found a bit more. In 2018, there was one taught at Arcadia Senior College in Maine.
Yeah.
So there's one, and I think as we dig in more, Ian, you did a bit more research. But in terms of collections and of manuscripts and notes, we'll put out a social media link to the Indiana University collection, which absolutely exists. It consists primarily of notes, full text manuscripts. So all of the O'Brien handwritten of 18 of his Aubrey Maturin sea novels with assorted notes. Also manuscripts for his biographies of Joseph Banks and Pablo Picasso. Ian, maybe we should get to the answer, and then I'd love to come back just for a minute to this Indiana set of manuscripts.
Yeah, it's fascinating that they ended up there.
Right.
It was an interesting kind of moment in O'Brien's growing celebrity. We also asked our friend Josh Corey, who is an actual professor of actual English literature.
Right.
By the way, I hope one day that the department at Durham University might get around to it. I'm not expecting it anytime soon. But Josh Corey, who teaches at Lake Forest College in Illinois, had this to say when we emailed him. Hello, Josh, if you're listening. He said, I haven't heard of O'Brien being taught at the university level, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. A quick search reveals that way back in 2000, there was somebody teaching about him in a class called Literature and the Sea, and he has appeared on the syllabus of a Canadian English professor, Alison May, who seems to have taught him in other courses as well. So that's what a quick look at Google Scholar gets you. We also get some academic papers. Josh says there was one in 2004 named The Early Bird is Worth Two in the Bush, Captain Jack Aubrey's Fractured Proverbs. So Aubreyisms have reached the world of literary criticism and academic analysis, which is great. That's a good thing about the world that we live in. There's also been quite a bit in online academic treatises about his de Beauvoir translations. Maybe the sort of proper authoritative syllabus on Patrick O'Brian studies is still waiting to be created, as Josh says, by an enterprising scholar, though he adds in the present era it would be an uphill climb given the unfashionableness of O'Brian's identity and some other major concerns. Josh says he'd love to teach Patrick O'Brian. He says it's harder in some ways to teach the books that you truly love as opposed to the ones that you admire. And it would be tough to sell in a small private college English department. Maybe, says Josh, there's room for a literature of the sea course or even an environmental literature course. Not a bad idea. That's what Josh tells us. So, not yet anybody with a master's program in O'Brian studies, but the material is out there, right, for further academic study.
Oh, it really is, Ian. And it was fascinating in that same Latitude 38 article we were talking about earlier with Tom Perkins. Perkins was saying that while they were cruising with Mary and Patrick O'Brian, that one evening there was a really heated discussion where O'Brian had asked Patrick if he'd heard of a place called Indiana and a school there. and Tom said, yeah, and they talked about that. And he was saying that the English department had purchased, but not yet paid for, 2 or 3 of his manuscripts. And there was a professor offering a course on O'Brian that O'Brian found particularly offensive. So he was, I think, second guessing some of this. And he said that because he was talking more about O'Brian, I guess, than the books, that O'Brian had decided that he was going to destroy all of his diaries and journals and all his correspondence so there'd be no trace of his existence. Well, Richard Allard, who we talked about before, some of the other literary erudite people around the table had said, oh, no, you can't do that. You remember when you were writing the Picasso biography, those were, they were so vital there. And I guess Tom followed up by saying, after Patrick's death, we understood some of his thinking, what was yet to come out from Dean King's research and others here, that, all of this. But he said that night aboard the Andromeda, his ship, only Mary knew the truth and understood O'Brian's deep motives for this passion around, I don't want them getting into all of my stuff. Just get into the books. Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's funny. He's not the only great artist to have really wanted to sort of protect himself from future biography. I'm busy reading a biography of the composer Johannes Brahms, who destroyed truckloads of stuff about himself and his personal writings and his early manuscripts, burned entire string quartets because he thought they weren't good enough, that he didn't want them to reach posterity. So, people with this kind of artistic endeavor can be prickly about what they leave behind for posterity. And it sounds like O'Brian was like that. In any case, the manuscripts and the notes did find their way to the Lilly collection at Indiana. So they ended up out there. They must have made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Right.
Oh, marvelous. So, Mike, we've had this spin-off into the world of academia. What other spin-off topics have we got here?
Well, we've got another one. Steve Tamargo asked us on Facebook, as a fan of both the Cannon and the Photon Torpedo, I wonder if you gentlemen could discuss your views on the parallels between Aubrey Maturin and Kirk Spock. Ian, I'm going to pause on mine. I think you've got a good idea. I'm going to phone a friend. So I said I'm going to call a friend. I need a lifeline here because, I just don't remember enough about Star Trek. So I have our good friend, Steve Morris of the podcast Cinephiles. But Steve, even more importantly, tell us about your other podcast first, and then let's run this question by you.
Well, with my good friend Scott Mance, we're both huge Star Trek fans, and so we started to do a breakdown of the original series, which we did. It's called Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. It was a fantastic experience, not just because I absolutely adore Star Trek, and we went episode by episode, beat by beat, moment by moment, but because of Scott Mance, we had some incredible guests on the show, and the one I want to share with you that's most important was we had Ralph Sinensky, who is today still around, 101 years old, who directed 6 of the original episodes of Star Trek. His mind is sharp as a tack.
Awesome.
And he came on for every single episode that he directed. And he would say things like, now that was the second take. Leonard flubbed his line on the first take. And his memory is the most so.
So cool.
Being able to go through these episodes with the director, in some cases, we had the writer of Trouble with Tribbles. We had the writer of Doomsday Machine. We had Walter Koenig, who plays Chekhov. We had actors from the show, writers from the show, and going through the original series like that. It was one of the great experiences of all time.
Awesome.
Outstanding.
So, Steve, once again, thanks so much for joining us. Let us read out to you the question that we got from listener Steve Tomargo, who joined us on Facebook with this question, and let's see where it takes us. Steve says, as a fan of both the Cannon and the Photon Torpedo, ho, 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 play on words, well done.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you gentlemen could discuss your views on the parallels between Aubrey Maturin and Kirk Spock. I know that the books were written after the run of Star Trek the original series, and it seems doubtful that O'Brien watched the show as he was developing his characters, but I find the similarities striking.
So the first thought I have is, and it's funny, I thought the same thing. Of course, Patrick O'Brien, he would never have watched Star Trek. And I suddenly went, I want to push back on that, because I think that's buying into the same myth that, geeks forever have dealt with, which is that science fiction and fantasy and superheroes is kid stuff. And of course, we know that science fiction in particular is been embraced by intellectuals forever. I mean, we know that Stephen Hawking is a huge Star Trek fan. Yeah. There's always Neil deGrasse Tyson, huge Star Trek fan. There are all sorts of intellectuals who are huge Star Trek fans. So I'm not going to say out of hand. I don't know if the guy had I can't even picture him watching TV, frankly. But, I don't think that he said, I'm not going to watch Star Trek tonight. I'm going to watch Gomer Pyle instead, because that was what was on the other channel. I think in that choice, Patrick O'Brien's more likely to watch Star Trek.
I don't think French TV had the franchise for Gomer Pyle in the late 60s, to be honest.
I don't know. They love Jerry Lewis. Why wouldn't they love Gomer Pyle?
Well, there's a valid point.
So the other thing, though, is thinking about this, and I wrote to you separately when you first sent me the question, is I found so much stuff. And here's the first one I wanted to share with you. Do you know what Gene Roddenberry frequently said was his main inspiration for Star Trek and the Enterprise?
Tell us.
It was the adventures of Horatio Hornblower.
Yay!
Nice.
That was the model in his head. That, and what he also called it Wagon Train to the Stars, because he wanted this group to be isolated and out in the wilderness where they didn't have contact with anyone else, and they had to make all of their own decisions. And some of the things that they did as they explored strange new worlds was they had to be the scientists and the diplomats, as well as the military and representatives of a government that was far, far away and couldn't influence them at all. And that sounds a lot like the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars.
So there's, rather than the one being inspired by the other, there's like a common ancestor there. I mean, we know that Forrester was in the mind of O'Brien at the time that he got asked to begin writing these, and Forrester was also in the mind of Roddenberry.
Yeah, I think, and it's so funny because I've read them both, and I've read them both many times, and they're interesting companions to each other in a strange way. Here's another thing that occurred to me is, and this is something you could definitely say of the Starship Enterprise, and you can also say it of Next Generation, which is that really all the characters that are aboard these ships, in a way, they're all orphans. They do have relationships with people that are back home, but their most important relationships are to the other people that are on the ship. That is, in fact, their family. And the dynamics within the ship, and whether it's going well or not going well, is critical to their lives. That's another similarity with the Starship Enterprise. And here's the other thing, and I know the question asks about Kirk and Spock, but I think you actually have to expand the question to be Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Yes, Kirk and Spock are the key first relationship, but they're really three best friends. And having intimate friends on board the Enterprise is a huge advantage for Kirk, which comes up over and over again, just as it's a huge advantage for Jack. Is that one of the things they talk about in the canon is that the fact that Jack has someone who isn't his military inferior, who's actually a friend who can push back with him and who he can share parts of himself with, make him not as likely to go crazy or go power mad as some of these other captains that we meet throughout the canon.
Right.
The same is true for Captain Kirk. You can see throughout the entire original series moments where both Spock and McCoy push back on Kirk and add different perspectives. Kirk's instinct is always to leap in first. He's always aggressive. which is also true of Jack. He's also the more aggressive person, and having the more intellectual, the more solid, kind of quiet person tempers Jack in ways that the same is happening for Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
The character of Captain Kirk has so much in common with Jack Aubrey. First of all, he's best on an independent command.
Yeah.
Kirk always runs into problems when there's commodores or ambassadors or other people that he has to serve under. He doesn't do as well. He definitely is interested in the ladies and has real problems with long-term relationships.
Right.
and basically, Kirk's true love, his real love, is the Enterprise. Yeah. And he said over and over and over again throughout Star Trek that Kirk's first love is the Enterprise. And in fact, his main conflict, which you see in episodes like The Naked Time, you see in the Paradise Syndrome, you see in all these, is that he has to sacrifice his own happiness over and over again in order to protect the Enterprise and the crew. That's his main relationship. And I think if you really, Jack Aubrey's, yes, he loves Sophie, but his main relationships are Stephen, the crew, and the ship, particularly the Surprise.
Yeah.
We just had that echoed in chapter 1 of Surprise we were recording today. Sophie saying, Stephen, would it do any good to tell Jack to be careful, to be prudent, not to take risks? And he said, Sophie, Jack loves his crew and his ship too much to take risks that aren't weighed. That he's a prudent man at sea, not on land. Yeah, and he doesn't do the same for Sophie and for his home and for his
Well, and when Kirk becomes an admiral in Wrath of Khan, McCoy tells him this is the worst thing you could have done. That you should never have taken the promotion. Your best job is commanding a ship.
Oh, I'd forgotten all about that. And that's like the echo of Stephen Maturin saying, authority is the death of a man's character.
Exactly. In terms of leadership, Kirk leads from the front. He knows his ship better than anyone else. He would definitely agree with Jack that a happy ship is the only strong fighting ship. That's the Enterprise.
Right.
That's totally the Enterprise. And I'll throw out one other one, is that Kirk has a son out of wedlock that took a different career path from him and was raised by his mother. And that's David Marcus in Wrath of Khan.
Whoa.
Insane.
And this one I had to look up. Is that so Wrath of Khan comes out in 82. Well, Sam Panda's introduced in Reverse of the Metal, which is 86. So he totally could have watched Wrath of Khan.
Wait.
If he could have found the remote, he could have watched Wrath of Khan.
Well, and by that time, is he talking to Americans?
86.
I mean, that's right when it started, right? In the mid-80s?
Right.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah.
All right, so that's Kirk. How about Spock now?
Good.
Spock is a person of two worlds. He's half human, half Vulcan. Stephen is half Catalan, half Irish.
Right.
Now, Spock isn't illegitimate, but definitely being raised on Vulcan, he had the pressure of being a social outcast and people not believing in his family background. He's definitely a person of two worlds. He's an extreme intellectual and an introvert who has nobody he can share his feelings with.
Yeah.
He's also the smartest guy on the ship. And in a way that he can't really, there's so many times where Stephen is so far ahead of everybody, including Jack, that he can only keep his thoughts to himself. There's literally nobody he can share his thoughts with because nobody is at his intellectual level. Even Jack, who's his best friend, who's quite brilliant, but can't share that with. That's Mr. Spock.
Nice.
Spock is deeply introverted.
Yep.
And particularly when we first meet him, totally incapable of expressing his true emotions about things. In The Naked Time, where they're all on whatever the disease is that's making them act drunk and act out, Spock has this emotional breakdown where he's trying to keep his emotional under control. And he says to Kirk, when I feel friendship for you, I'm ashamed.
Oh, wow.
Is that's how emotionally he keeps everything inside. And you talk about a person, particularly in his relationship with Diana, who emotionally is keeping everything inside and not sharing them. That's Stephen.
Can I try out a potential difference and see what you think?
Sure.
You know the characters better.
Well, there are differences because they're different,
Yeah. Well, and let's see. So it seems that Stephen has his idea of how he's going to cope with his identity and his kind of otherness and his strange place in the world. And it comes from a lot of kind of internal thinking and wrangling that he's done. And I always got the impression with Spock that he had this composure and this insight kind of from first principles. That was his kind of gift as a Vulcan. Is that fair to Spock? Do we see signs in his character that he's done some wrangling with his own self in the past?
Oh, yes. Huge signs. I really think in a lot of ways, the greatest character of Star Trek is Mr. Spock.
Yeah.
Because Star Trek wrestles with the ideas of emotion and logic throughout the entire run of Star Trek. And Spock, from when we meet him, is extremely stunted emotionally. And he said, I'm choosing logic 100%. I'm trying to get rid of my emotions. And this happens multiple times in the series. At the beginning of Star Trek The Motion Picture, Spock has left Starfleet to go off to Vulcan to go through some ritual, which is the final purging of all emotion from his system. And then through his interaction with V'ger, he has this reaction of like, oh, because V'ger is the Earth satellite that went out into orbit and it's coming back looking for its creator. And what Spock says, V'ger knows everything in the galaxy, except he doesn't know human feeling and emotion. And from that point forward, Spock is embracing the human emotional side. So by the time you get to Star Trek 4 and then Star Trek 6, there's this very wise person who's really found a way to balance all of those things out. That's the journey of Mr. Spock from beginning to end. And it's central to ideas of Star Trek of like, well, how, because Kirk is frequently the opposite. I am sacrificing my personal happiness to do what is right.
Yeah.
And so he's having the opposite battle throughout his life. And I think that wrestling, I mean, what could we say about Stephen Maturin if he's not wrestling inside his mind with these ideas and human life and what does it mean? I think that's central to it. Here's another one about Spock. What is his job on the Enterprise? He is the science officer.
Yeah.
And there are multiple times in the original series where Kirk is like, particularly like the Horta and Devil in the Dark, and Kirk's like, we got to kill it. And Spock is arguing like, this is a scientific opportunity that you will be destroying. There are multiple times that Spock is arguing against Kirk doing a military action in order to support science. Other small ones, Spock is a musician.
Is he?
Absolutely. He plays the Vulcan lute, which you see a couple of times, most notably in The Way to Eden with the space hippies.
Right.
Right.
I don't think my parents let me watch that one.
And here's one other one that maybe you'll think is a joke, but I kind of don't, is one thing about Spock, sex makes him crazy. Once every 7 years, he goes nuts because of the Ponfar. It totally destroys him. The logical person is completely destroyed by sexual desire, and that is 100% Stephen Maturin. He is a totally solid guy, except for Diana, and she absolutely wrecks him.
Yep, living rent-free in his head.
Yep.
Right.
And then there's McCoy, because McCoy, well, first of all, he's the doctor. You know, so a big hunk of the Stephen Maturin stuff is in the Doctor. He is completely non-military, doesn't care about rank, isn't involved in any of that, is 100% cares about healing people and saving people, is continually critical of Captain Kirk and of Spock, and has no problem confronting him on the bridge or anyone else and being completely rude. And when McCoy loses his temper, he is darn scary, which so is Stephen. Is when that vicious nastiness comes out of him, he will destroy anybody. And McCoy is very much the same way. He also is very uncomfortable with the technology of getting him on and off the ship. He hates the transporter. And I think of all the times that Stephen, who never has figured out how the ship works, it ends up getting dunked in the water because he can't do the basic things that most seamen can do. For me, Jack and Stephen are the greatest friendship in literature. I really can't think of any characters that have 20 and a little bit more books of watching their friendship grow over time. There's nothing like that. And for me, Kirk and Spock, or Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, are the greatest friendship in TV and film.
Steve, I love the parallels that you've come up with Star Trek and the canon. So anything that we can learn from the fans of Star Trek, what can we take away for fans of O'Brien?
So after 3 seasons in 1969, Star Trek gets canceled.
Yeah.
And that is just, even though there's a huge fan group that wants it to keep going, NBC, they were not into it. Star Trek is dead. And then all of these fans kept it alive. They kept it alive with conventions. They kept it alive with talking about it. And they pushed so hard that first they decided to do an animated series, which aired in the early 70s. And then there was still so much upswell that people kept it alive until finally you got Star Trek The Motion Picture, which led to all of the Star Trek we have today, particularly after Wrath of Khan, where now there's over 900 episodes of Star Trek that we can consume. That's more than anything else I think that's ever been done in the world. 900 episodes,
Wow.
all from this idea.
Even the Sopranos didn't manage that many.
No, not quite. And I remember when my good friend Steve Jones called me to tell me that Patrick O'Brien had passed away.
Yeah.
And I was so crushed because I went, it's over.
That's it.
But here we are 20 plus years after that, sitting in this podcast, we're keeping it alive.
Amen.
And yes, unlike Star Trek, we're not going to bring in nobody can write these characters, but we could have that series on TV that I would really like to have, or a new series of movies. And we all can still get together and read the books and celebrate it and enjoy this just the way that those Star Trek fans were keeping Star Trek alive in the late 60s and early 70s.
Oh, I love that.
Great thought. Steve, thanks so much.
We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Loads of fun, as always.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was lots of fun. Well, anytime. You know, I like talking Patrick O'Brien, so.
Great to talk to Steve, as always. Thanks as well to the other Steve for the question. Mike, let's pick up our next question here.
Anthony Vogel, our Patreon supporter.
Him again.
He said, yeah, him again. Oh, we love him. We love him. And we're following, it's funny because he's following us and we're following him. We're loving the great things that are happening in Anthony's life right now.
Hey guys, Anthony Vogel here from Macedon, New York. I've been a listener from the very beginning and love what you guys do. Thanks so much for creating this journey for all of us. I should like it of all things if you would answer the following question. What did your wives or sweethearts think of just this journey in the very beginning and now toward the end? Have they read the books as well? Or do they, like my own wife and sweetheart, treat this as your own hobby? Thanks so much again. I look forward to the answer and a glass of wine with each of you.
Thank you for the question, Anthony. It's a great question. Mrs. Bradley, who goes by the first name Joy, is completely mystified. Joy tolerates me and my many years of O'Brien addiction, and these days my podcast adventures, with kindly forbearance and huge amounts of support and love and encouragement and time. But participation, listening, reading the books, that's not for her. As Mike might be about to say about himself as well, I'm married way above my station. I'm batting well above my average. And
yeah, no question about that, Ian. Both of it. Absolutely. We have like the best wives in the world and the best sweethearts.
Yes.
Both in one. Let me be quick to clarify. So Annie, my bride, has not read the books, though she said she feels like she has because my first time through, that was all I talked about. And she remembers it much better than I do. As a matter of fact, to answer some of these questions, like what did you first think and everything, I had to go back to her and say, hey, love, what did I think back then? What did I say about what? So, yeah, it's absolutely tolerated. The other day, Ian said something about taking some time and said, but I hesitate because I'm worried that one day I'm going to see Annie and she's going to jump out of the shadows with a 2x4. And Annie responded, oh, I might someday, but it won't be Ian I'll be looking at. So
okay.
She's all good. And, if it goes on another 10 years, I don't know. Probably not. We'll see.
It's funny. I'll say one more thing about my efforts to get Joy to read these books. And historical fiction is absolutely something that she's read. Genre fiction and serial science fiction is something that she absolutely loves and devours wholesale. And I think the closest I would ever get would be to saying that the flow of the series and the span and the scope of the characters is pretty similar to something like Game of Thrones. And she was a George R.R. Martin reader long before those books came on the TV screen. But the initial apparent maleness, the impenetrable regency and naval bits and pieces, and all the obscure, what she would regard as, showing off levels of literary illusion, I think she would say, no, there's something more straightforward that I can reach for that will tell me more directly what's going on without all of this mumbo jumbo. But I think there's a real closeness between the attraction that science fiction has for its fans in terms of world building and character arcs and all that. Parallel between that and what O'Brien does.
Nice. Mark Pruitt, Patreon supporter. can we have an expert in 18th century medicine on to talk about Stephen's profession?
Good question.
Boy, we have tried and tried and tried. Ian's is just, gone after somebody like this since the very early days of the show. And there were a number of such speakers in the early days of the canon. They would be on these panels together along with people that were doing, the cookbook, along with people that were doing all these other things. And we have not landed one yet. We came so close, but have yet to land one. We do have, there's always online Matron's Medicine, can do a little bit of this. And there's somebody who in the UK is very well versed and talks about these kinds of things a lot in the period, not so much from the books, but haven't been able to land them.
Yeah, we'll keep trying.
Sorry. Yes.
Great. And thank you, Mark, for the question. Another one of our repeat guests, Stephen Biankowski, who was tearing up the Facebook airwaves with another great question. How long does it take you to record a session of The Lover's Hole? So I'll say that we are recording on about a 2-week cycle. So between 10 and 14 days after we sit down and record, we have to get that material edited. It has to have by a week and a half to 2 weeks after that, it has to be edited down and ready to get out. Mike, do you want to talk us through what's the process of getting there and then what happens after it's been recorded?
Yeah, so like on average, some more, some less, particularly, if we're including interviews, if we're including things like this that we put together. But on average, a couple days of reading and listening and rereading and re-listening and talking and taking notes and getting ideas together. I think Ian and I are both prepping ourselves before we get together, and then we pull those together and take perhaps maybe 3 hours, give or take, sometimes more, to record. We spend a lot of time talking through, kind of sharing notes, sharing research. We oftentimes end up going down more research holes as we're talking, because that's how we're both prone to be. And then we put all that together, and God bless them, Ian and Sam work their editing magic. I get to come back and do a little proof of the last draft before before Ian posts it. So all the technology over there, Ian, I have no idea how much time you spend on technology, on socials, on editing, on interviewing and finding people and writing questions and all of that.
Hard to put a number on per episode. Some episodes where we just sit down and read and talk, and your notes are getting there, I have to do very little. And then if the same episode results in, like Sam, as he very often does, gets it right first time, it can go super smoothly. There are other times when it turns out the audio quality wasn't great, or it turns out I've made some mistakes in continuity, or it turns out we got extra stuff to drop in. Then the post-production process takes a long time. As you say, Mike, if we've had an interview, then we've got quite a lot of work to do to corral the content of the interview back into audio. And again, Sam helps us with that with a couple of different iterations, so that we quite often end up, if we have an interview, we end up with what goes into the episode, and a longer cut we'll preserve some of the other good bits for our Patreon supporters as well, as a way of giving them something back for their support in the show. So short answer, it depends.
Right.
Great stuff.
Mike Taylor on Facebook Messenger, about the plans for the show. Not listening to you both talking about Patrick O'Brian's canon is going to leave a bit of a gap, to say the least. Thank you, Mike. Very kind.
Amen.
Is there another similar project in the offing? Funny you should mention. Funny you should ask, Mike. There is another project, yes. Similar, we think it's similar, but I think a lot of people might not see the connections there. In a very remote but substantive way. No name yet, but Ian and I were chatting about this the other day, and he said, well, it's kind of consulting for humans. And I think that's it. That's the magic. That's the connection for us, is the humanity. People, how we help each other, why we do what we do, what we can do to be better, to do better, those elements will remain, but this is going to go into the world of what Ian and I have done for, you know, for many years
Decades.
and done together. Right. I know it's amazing to think. And what Ian is still absolutely wrapped up in now. It's the reason we were in Florida together to record this last episode. That you'll hear this, well, no, that you heard last weekend. Now that time wise, but that is coming. It's something I know I'm very excited about. It's something my bride has given her blessing to, and something that I really look forward to because I still get to spend time with my particular friend.
Amen. Yeah, same for me. And what that's going to mean is Ian and Mike are not going to be making audio content every week about Patrick O'Brian or anything related to it, and we're going to miss that. But we're not there yet. We have a couple of things that we need to take care of, including getting back through HMS Surprise, including getting eventually the last thing that we do with the Lover's Hole project will be to read 21, the unfinished episode. We've got a couple of great interviews that we're going to try and reel in and bring to you. And we have some other bits of Aubrey Maturin adjacent work that we're going to try and weave in here. So we're not done yet. That brings me on to Mike's next question, where he says, is there scope to look at some of Patrick O'Brian's earlier maritime novels or to pick some other books in the canon for deeper analysis and discussion?
It's like a very kind question, and you're absolutely right. Ian said, we've got a little bit room to look a little bit wider here. And so given our most recent discussion, the answer is yes, absolutely yes. You want to talk about what we're...
Yes, indeed. So we had a conversation about this with our Patreons a little while ago, and one of the things that was a really strong want from them that we are big fans of the idea of as well was to go back to look at O'Brian's two earlier books, The Golden Ocean of 1956 and The Unknown Shore of 1959. We've actually mentioned them in the canonical episodes just in the last week or two. I don't think we'll necessarily go to the one chapter per episode pace because they're shorter, you might say lighter books, although they're still Patrick O'Brian, and they probably, you would say, are targeted to a less mature audience. But they absolutely have strong kind of prototype vibes in them for O'Brian creating the world of and the characters of Stephen Maturin and Jack Aubrey. It'll take us a bit more reading and absorbing and research and talking to get as deeply into them as we've got into the Aubrey Maturin books, because we've both circumnavigated the Aubrey Maturin books and talked about them a lot away from the microphone. But we'd love to dig into Golden Ocean and Unknown Shore and bring those to you as part of our kind of final flow through the canon here and as part of the last few stages in the story of the Lover's Hole. In the meantime, if you're really interested in those two books, by the way, read them because they're great and they won't spoil anything about your enjoyment of the Aubrey Maturin canon, and they're absolutely worth a serious read by anybody who loves books about the sea. If you're also really interested, I strongly recommend you read The Wager by David Gran. It's no accident that Leonardo DiCaprio is signed up potentially, according to Hollywood rumor, to star in the movie, because The Wager is to seafaring what The Revenant is to bear hunting. So if you thought The Revenant was a bit grim and a bit chilly and a bit dark, then I think you're going to really enjoy The Wager.
Nice.
Very good.
Ian, on that note, I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, there may be a few other questions. I apologize if we haven't gotten to all of them. Hit us back up again and maybe we'll pop something at the end of an episode coming, later. But thank you so much for the questions. Thank you for listening. Patrons, thank you for your support. We couldn't be doing this without you, and we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for all the questions. We've had a really good time putting this together and chatting away. It's a nice change of pace. But Mike, the pace is still going on, right? We got to the end of Post Captain. What a chapter that was, the final chapter of Post Captain. Next week, we have the chance to reach up to the bookshelf and take down for our slower one chapter per episode paced reading of HMS Surprise. So, Mike, I've got to ask you, my friend, with all that's come before, with all that's still to come, what do you say to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brian?
What? And turning to my favorite book, I should like that of all things.